there exists a peculiar kind of suffering that has no name in our medical textbooks, no diagnosis code, no pharmaceutical remedy. It is the suffering of a life half-lived, of potential locked behind invisible bars, of a song that was meant to be sung but remains trapped in the throat of the singer. Carl Jung spent his lifetime studying this unnamed affliction, and he discovered something startling. Most people are not afraid of death. They are afraid of life, the real life that demands they become fully themselves. Consider the moment just before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. In that liminal space, many people wake with a feeling they cannot quite name. It is not sadness exactly, though sadness is part of it. It is not merely tiredness, though exhaustion colors every thought. It is something deeper, more ancient, more true. It is the soul whispering that the life being lived is not the life that was meant to be lived. This whisper comes in the space between sleep and waking, before the armor of the day is strapped on, before the performance begins again. Jung called this the voice of the self, trying to break through the noise of the persona, the mask, the false identity constructed to survive in a world that rarely asks who you truly are, but constantly demands what you can produce, how you can serve, whether you fit the acceptable template. The tragedy is not that we hear this voice. The tragedy is that most of us have become experts at silencing it before it can finish its sentence. A man stands in front of the mirror each morning, straightening his tie, preparing his face for another day of meetings and obligations. For a brief moment, he catches his own eye and feels something flicker, a question perhaps, or a memory of someone he used to be or might have been. But the moment passes. He has trained himself not to linger in such dangerous territory. He has bills to pay, responsibilities to honor, a reputation to maintain. The flicker dies. The mask slides into place. Another day begins in the life of someone who looks like him, but isn't quite him. Or think of the woman who has spent decades being indispensable, the one everyone turns to, the one who solves problems and manages crises and holds everything together. She is so good at this role that she has forgotten it is a role. When someone asks what she wants, truly wants for herself alone, her mind goes blank. The question feels almost offensive, as if wanting something purely for herself would be an act of betrayal against all those who depend on her. She has become so identified with her function that her being has dissolved into her doing. This is the silence that screams. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that cannot be said, everything that has been pushed down, locked away, deemed inappropriate or impractical or impossible. Jung understood that this silence accumulates like pressure in a closed system. It builds and builds until something must give, until the carefully constructed life begins to crack, until what he called the psyche stages an intervention through symptoms that cannot be ignored, depression that resists medication, anxiety that has no clear source, physical illness that appears mysteriously, relationships that suddenly feel suffocating. The silence contains multitudes. It holds every dream that was too impractical to pursue, every desire that seemed too selfish to honor, every truth that was too dangerous to speak, every version of yourself that didn't fit the acceptable narrative. These unlived possibilities do not evaporate. They settle in the body as tension, in the mind as restlessness, in the soul as a persistent, gnawing sense that something essential is missing even when everything appears to be in place. Jung discovered through his work with thousands of patients that this suffering intensifies in what he called the second half of life, usually beginning somewhere in the mid to late 30s or early 40s. The structures that seemed so important in youth, the achievements, the status, the accumulation of things and accolades, begin to feel hollow. The goals that once motivated now feel meaningless. A successful businessman suddenly cannot find the energy to go to work. A devoted mother whose children have grown feels lost in her own home. These are not failures of character or willpower. These are signs that the soul is demanding a reckoning. The silence that screams is actually a call, an invitation from the deepest part of yourself, asking whether you will spend the rest of your days maintaining the life you have built, or whether you will risk everything to discover the life you were meant to live. Most people, when they hear this call, find ways to turn up the volume on everything else. More work, more distractions, more noise to drown out the voice that asks uncomfortable questions. But Jung warned that the psyche will not be silenced indefinitely. If you will not listen to its whisper, it will eventually shout. If you will not respond to gentle invitations, it will send crises. Long before you could speak, you were learning who you were allowed to be. Not through words, but through the subtle language of approval and disapproval. Through the light in your mother's eyes when you behaved a certain way, and the shadow that fell when you did not. Through the tone of voice that said, "Good child," or the silence that said, "You have disappointed us." You learned that love, that most essential need, came with conditions. And so you began the work of becoming acceptable, which is also the work of becoming not quite yourself. Jung observed that every human being constructs what he called a persona, a social mask that allows us to function in the collective world. The word comes from the Latin for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater, and this is precisely what the persona is: a character we play, a role we perform, the face we show to the world while our true face remains hidden, sometimes even from ourselves. In childhood, the creation of this persona is necessary, even healthy. A child must learn to adapt to social reality, to function in groups, to navigate the demands of family and school and culture. The problem arises when the persona becomes so convincing, so well practiced, so reinforced by years of reward and punishment, that we forget it is a mask at all. We begin to believe that the character we play is who we actually are. The performance becomes indistinguishable from the performer. And this is when the real trouble begins, because the persona, no matter how successful, can never satisfy the soul. It is by definition a partial expression, a reduced version, an adaptation to external demands, rather than an emanation of internal truth. Consider the child who is naturally quiet, introspective, comfortable in solitude. But he grows up in a culture that celebrates extroversion, that sees quietness as a problem to be fixed, so he learns to be louder than he is, more social than he wants to be, constantly pushing himself to meet an ideal that feels foreign to his nature. Over time, this act becomes automatic. He no longer notices the effort it requires. He has become the extroverted persona so completely that when someone calls him outgoing, he agrees, not recognizing the lie, not remembering the quiet child who still lives within, exiled and ignored. Or imagine a girl who is born with fierce intelligence and natural authority, who asks difficult questions and challenges assumptions and leads rather than follows. But she grows up in a family or community where such qualities in girls are seen as threatening. So she learns to soften herself, to question less, to make herself smaller, to let others lead even when she knows better. She constructs a persona of the agreeable woman, the one who supports rather than challenges, who goes along to get along. This persona brings her acceptance, even love, but it also creates a split, a fracture between who she appears to be and who she actually is. The persona is built from compromises, each one seemingly small and reasonable. You compromise your natural rhythm to fit someone else's schedule. You compromise your true opinion to avoid conflict. You compromise your deep desires to meet external expectations. None of these compromises feels like a betrayal in the moment. They feel like maturity, like wisdom, like the price of admission to adult life. But they accumulate. And eventually, you look in the mirror and see a stranger, someone who has all the markers of success, but none of the feeling of aliveness, someone who has won at a game they never chose to play. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the inflation of the persona, the state in which a person becomes entirely identified with their role, their title, their function. The doctor who cannot separate his sense of self from his profession, the mother who has no identity beyond motherhood, the executive who is only as real as her latest achievement. When the persona inflates to fill the entire psyche, it squeezes out everything else, every quality that doesn't serve the role, every desire that doesn't fit the image, every aspect of the self that is complex, contradictory, or simply human. This inflation creates a particular kind of fragility, because when your entire sense of self is invested in a role, any threat to that role becomes a threat to your very existence. The doctor who receives a poor review feels not just criticized, but annihilated. The mother whose children leave home experiences not just empty nest, but existential crisis. The executive who is fired loses not just a job, but a self. This is why midlife crises are so common and so devastating. The persona that worked for decades suddenly stops working, and there is nothing beneath it. No foundation, no core, just a terrible void where a self should be. The costume we call identity becomes a prison, but it is a prison we often defend because it is familiar, because we have invested so much in maintaining it, because we fear that without it, we will be nothing at all. Jung insisted that this fear is the greatest obstacle to individuation. We cling to the false self because we do not trust that a true self exists beneath it. We hold tight to the mask because we have forgotten we have a face. And so we live in this strange twilight, not quite dead, but not fully alive, going through motions that look like life from the outside, but feel hollow from within. The work of becoming whole requires us to do something terrifying. We must begin to loosen our grip on the persona, to create space between our role and our being, to ask, not who I am supposed to be, but who I actually am beneath all the costumes, all the performances, all the carefully curated versions I have presented to the world. This is not about destroying the persona entirely. We need it to function, but we must learn to wear it lightly, to remember it is a tool, not an identity, a mask we put on and take off rather than a face we are stuck with forever. Within each person exists a vast landscape that remains unmapped, territories of the psyche that have never been explored, because to venture there would require leaving behind the safe, known world of conscious identity. Jung called this unmapped territory the unconscious, and he spent his life insisting that most of what we are lives there, in the darkness beyond the reach of our awareness, influencing everything we think and feel and do from behind the scenes. The unconscious is not simply the repository of forgotten memories or random dreams. It is an entire ecosystem of denied emotions, rejected qualities, unlived possibilities, and archetypal patterns inherited from the collective human experience. Everything you could not allow yourself to be, everything you had to exile to maintain your acceptable persona, lives in this inner territory. Not dead, but very much alive, waiting, calling, demanding acknowledgement. Think of a garden where certain plants are deemed acceptable and others are pulled out as weeds. But the unwanted plants do not disappear. Their roots remain in the soil, spreading underground, drawing nutrients, biding time. They will push through eventually, perhaps in unexpected places, perhaps in forms that are harder to manage than if they had been allowed to grow in the first place. The exiled parts of the psyche work the same way. They do not vanish because we ignore them. They grow in the darkness, gathering strength, and eventually they break through in symptoms, in compulsions, in sudden, inexplicable reactions that seem to come from nowhere. A woman who has exiled her anger, who has spent her entire life being the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who never loses control, suddenly finds herself screaming over something trivial, a spilled drink or a misplaced key. The rage is disproportionate, frightening, seemingly irrational, but it is not irrational at all. It is decades of unexpressed anger finally breaking through the dam. It is the exiled part demanding to be heard, choosing its moment when the conscious defenses are temporarily down. Or consider the man who prides himself on his rationality, his logical mind, his ability to make decisions based on facts rather than feelings. He has exiled his emotional self, sent it into the wilderness of the unconscious. But emotions do not die from neglect. They become more primitive, more powerful, more uncontrollable. So this rational man finds himself making terrible decisions when emotions do finally surface, falling into destructive relationships, making impulsive choices, acting in ways that contradict everything he believes about himself. This is not a failure of rationality. This is what happens when emotions are forced to speak from exile, rather than given a seat at the table of consciousness. The geography of inner exile is personal, but also collective. Jung discovered that beneath our individual unconscious lies what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that contains patterns, images, and potentials shared by all humanity. Here live the archetypes, the fundamental templates of human experience: the mother, the father, the hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self. These are not learned but inherited, encoded in the structure of the psyche itself, and they exert enormous influence on our lives, whether we acknowledge them or not. When we live only in the narrow band of consciousness, identifying entirely with our ego and persona, we cut ourselves off from this deeper source of meaning and energy. We become like plants, trying to live without roots, drawing all our nourishment from the thin soil of conscious awareness, while vast reserves of vitality remain untapped beneath. This is why so many people feel exhausted, depleted, running on empty despite having comfortable lives. They are living from a very small part of themselves, exiled from their own depths. The journey that Jung called individuation requires us to become explorers of this inner territory, to venture into the unconscious, not with the goal of conquering it or bringing it under control, but with the intention of knowing it, befriending it, integrating it into a larger sense of who we are. This is not a journey that can be made through pure intellect or willpower. The unconscious does not speak the language of logic. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the body's symptoms, in the sudden emotions that overtake us, in the patterns we cannot seem to break, no matter how much we understand them intellectually. To enter this territory is to accept that you are much more than you think you are, both more dark and more light, more complex and more simple, more wounded and more whole than the narrow identity of consciousness allows. It is to discover that what you thought was the entirety of yourself is actually just the tip of an iceberg, and beneath the surface lies an entire world that has been shaping your life all along, pulling strings you could not see, speaking in a voice you could not hear, trying desperately to get your attention through any means available. Among all the territories of the unconscious, there is one that Jung considered most crucial to encounter on the path to wholeness, and it is the one we are most desperate to avoid. He called it the shadow, and it contains everything about ourselves that we cannot accept, everything we have deemed bad or wrong or unworthy, everything that contradicts the image we need to maintain. The shadow is our inner exile, the parts of us we have banished to the darkest corners of the psyche because we were taught they were unacceptable. The shadow begins forming in early childhood. Every time you are told that a natural part of you is wrong, that part does not disappear. It goes underground. The little boy who is told that crying is weak does not stop having feelings, he just stops showing them. They go into the shadow. The little girl who is punished for her anger does not stop feeling angry. She just learns to suppress it. The anger joins the shadow. Over years, the shadow accumulates everything you had to reject to be loved, to be safe, to belong. But here is what makes the shadow so powerful and so dangerous when left unexamined. It does not remain passive in its exile. It has its own energy, its own life, its own agenda. And from the darkness of the unconscious, it influences your behavior in ways you do not recognize and would likely deny if someone pointed them out. Jung wrote that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow must be met, known, and ultimately integrated if we are to become whole. The shadow reveals itself in your reactions, particularly the ones that seem disproportionate or confusing. When you feel intense dislike for someone you barely know, often the shadow is at work. What you despise in them is likely a quality you possess, but refuse to acknowledge in yourself. The person who irritates you with their neediness may reflect your own unmet dependency needs. The colleague whose arrogance infuriates you may mirror your own disowned desire for recognition. We project our shadow onto others, seeing in them what we cannot see in ourselves. The shadow also appears in your self-sabotage, in the ways you undermine your own success or happiness. A woman finally achieves the recognition she has worked for, and then she does something to destroy it, picks a fight, misses a deadline, says something inappropriate. This is not simply bad luck or poor judgment. This is the shadow at work, the part that believes she does not deserve success, the part that learned long ago that being too visible or too successful was dangerous. From its exile, it reaches out and pulls the plug just when things are going well. Or consider the man who consciously values health but repeatedly engages in destructive behaviors, drinking too much, working to exhaustion, avoiding exercise. His conscious mind has one set of values, but his shadow holds another. Perhaps in his shadow lives the rebellious teenager who was never allowed to make his own choices, who was always controlled and managed. Now, that exiled part expresses itself through self-destructive rebellion, choosing short-term pleasure over long-term well-being, not because he does not know better, but because his shadow is finally getting to make some choices, even if they are destructive ones. Meeting the shadow requires exceptional courage because it means admitting that you are not who you think you are. It means acknowledging that you contain qualities you have spent your life condemning in others. It means facing the possibility that your most righteous judgments might be projections, that your clearest certainties might be defenses, that the person you have worked so hard to be is only half the story. Jung insisted that the shadow is not evil, though it can feel that way when you first turn to look at it. The shadow is simply human, containing all the natural qualities that were deemed unacceptable by the particular family and culture you were born into. In a different time or place, these same qualities might have been valued. There is nothing inherently wrong with them. They were just inconvenient to the life you were trying to build, the person you were trying to become. The work of shadow integration is not about acting on every impulse or expressing every dark thought. It is about bringing these aspects into consciousness, where you can make choices about them rather than being controlled by them from the darkness. When anger moves from the shadow into consciousness, you gain the ability to use it constructively, to set boundaries, to protect yourself, to fuel necessary change. When it remains in the shadow, it leaks out in passive aggression, in sudden explosions, in chronic resentment. One woman described her shadow encounter this way. She had always prided herself on her compassion, her ability to forgive, her spiritual practice of seeing the good in everyone. Then, in therapy, she discovered a rage so intense it shocked her. Beneath her practiced compassion was a fury at every person who had hurt her, every boundary that had been crossed, every time she had swallowed her truth to keep the peace. That rage did not make her compassion false, but her compassion had become a defense against feeling her rage. Only by acknowledging the rage could she develop genuine compassion, the kind that includes healthy boundaries and self-protection alongside forgiveness. The shadow is the mirror that reveals what we have been hiding from ourselves. To look into it is uncomfortable, even painful, but it is also liberating, because every quality you reclaim from the shadow is energy that returns to you, vitality that has been locked away, becoming available again. The more of your shadow you can integrate, the more whole you become, the more of your natural power you reclaim, the less energy you spend on maintaining walls between acceptable you and unacceptable you. You become one person instead of two, no longer divided against yourself. After descending into the darkness, after meeting the shadow and beginning the difficult work of integration, something mysterious begins to occur. The psyche, which had been fragmented into conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, begins to reorganize itself around a new center. Jung called this center the self with a capital S, distinguishing it from the small self of ego consciousness. The self is the totality of who you are, the union of all opposites, the reconciliation of light and dark, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine energies within. The movement toward this wholeness is what Jung named individuation, and he saw it as the fundamental task of the second half of life. Individuation does not mean becoming an individual in the sense of being separate or isolated. It means becoming undivided, whole, the person you were always meant to be. before layers of conditioning, trauma, and adaptation obscured your essential nature. It is not about becoming something new, but about uncovering what was always there, buried beneath years of compromise and conformity. This process is alchemical in the truest sense. In medieval alchemy, practitioners sought to transform lead into gold, base matter into something precious. Jung understood that this was never really about physical substances, but about psychological transformation. The lead is the raw, unformed, conflicted state of the psyche. The gold is wholeness, integration, the philosopher's stone that represents the self. The alchemical process is the journey from fragmentation to unity, from unconsciousness to awareness, from persona to authenticity. The transformation happens through what alchemists called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites within. The conscious must marry the unconscious. The persona must integrate the shadow. The rational must embrace the intuitive. What you have kept separate must come together. This is not a comfortable process. When opposites meet, there is friction, conflict, sometimes crisis. The old structures that kept everything neatly divided must break down before a new synthesis can emerge. A man who has lived entirely in his rational mind, who has achieved great success through logic, planning, and control, suddenly finds his carefully ordered life falling apart. Dreams become vivid and disturbing. Emotions he thought he had mastered overwhelm him. Coincidences and synchronicities multiply, suggesting that life is more mysterious than his rational worldview allowed. This is not breakdown, but breakthrough, the unconscious demanding recognition, the alchemical process beginning whether he consents or not. Or a woman who is identified entirely with being strong, independent, needing no one, finds herself in a situation where she must accept help, must admit vulnerability, must allow herself to be supported. Everything in her resists. Her entire identity has been built on self-sufficiency. But the psyche is orchestrating a conjunctio, bringing together her strength and her vulnerability, showing her that true wholeness includes both the capacity to stand alone and the capacity to lean on others. The alchemical transformation requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's innate ability to bring together opposites and create something new from their union. This is not a mental process that can be forced through willpower or positive thinking. It happens in its own time, through its own mysterious workings. Your task is not to make it happen, but to allow it, to hold the tension of opposites without collapsing into one side or the other, to stay present in the discomfort of not knowing who you are becoming while the old you dies and the new you is not yet born. This liminal space, this in-between time, is where most people get stuck. It is deeply uncomfortable to be neither who you were nor who you will be. The temptation is to rush back to the familiar, to reconstruct the persona, to stuff the shadow back into darkness, to make everything comfortable again, even if it means remaining fragmented. But Jung insisted that individuation requires the courage to stay in the fire, to endure the alchemical cooking until the transformation is complete. The signs that transformation is occurring are subtle at first. You notice you are responding differently to situations that used to trigger automatic reactions. A criticism that would have devastated you now rolls off. A temptation that would have overwhelmed you now has no power. You find yourself making choices that would have been impossible before, saying no without guilt, pursuing desires without justification, allowing yourself to simply be without constant self-improvement. The alchemical process also changes how you relate to others. When you are no longer projecting your shadow, you can see people as they actually are, rather than as screens for your unconscious material. Relationships become clearer, more honest, less entangled. You can love without losing yourself. You can maintain boundaries without walls. You can be intimate without fusion. The other person becomes truly other, rather than an extension of your psyche. Perhaps the most profound change is a shift in the center of gravity of your being. Where once the ego sat at the center, trying to control everything, trying to maintain the persona, trying to keep the shadow at bay, now the self emerges as the true center. The ego becomes a servant rather than a master, taking its rightful place as one part of a much larger whole. This shift feels like relief, like coming home, like finally being able to rest because you are no longer fighting yourself. The goal that the alchemists sought is not perfection. It is wholeness, the state of containing everything you are without judgment, holding light and dark, success and failure, strength and weakness, all of it together in a paradoxical unity that transcends simple categories of good and bad. You become comfortable with your own contradictions. You no longer need to resolve every paradox or present a consistent image. You are large enough to contain multitudes. When the alchemical transformation reaches a certain depth, when individuation has progressed far enough that you are living more from the self than from the ego, something unexpected occurs. You discover that becoming yourself is not a selfish act, but a generous one. The gift of your wholeness extends beyond you, rippling out in ways you cannot predict or control, touching others, shifting something in the collective field of human consciousness. Jung believed that every person who completes even part of the individuation journey performs a service not just for themselves, but for humanity. Because when you withdraw your projections, when you stop acting out your unconscious patterns, when you become conscious of what has been driving you from the darkness, you reduce by one person the amount of unconsciousness in the world. You become a small light in the collective darkness, not through what you preach, but through who you are. The gift manifests in quiet ways. Your presence changes. People notice something different about you, though they may not be able to name it. You carry less urgency, less desperation, less need to convince or convert or control. There is a stillness in you, a groundedness that comes from being rooted in something deeper than circumstances. This presence alone is healing. Others relax in your company because you are no longer projecting your anxiety, your shadow, your need for validation onto them. You also become capable of a different quality of listening. When you have faced your own darkness, you can sit with others in theirs without trying to fix it or flee from it. When you have integrated your shadow, you can hear others share theirs without judgment or shock. Your compassion deepens because it is no longer based on identification or pity, but on recognition that we are all struggling with the same fundamental human condition, all carrying wounds, all working with limited consciousness, all doing the best we can with what we know. The individuated person does not live by conventional morality imposed from outside, but by an inner ethical sense that Jung called the voice of the self. This is not license to do whatever you want. It is actually a more demanding ethics because there is no authority to hide behind, no rules to simply follow. You must discern moment by moment what integrity requires, what your particular path demands, how to honor both your own truth and your responsibility to others. This creates a particular kind of courage. You can withstand opposition because your validation comes from within rather than from external approval. You can take unpopular stances when your inner voice demands it. You can walk away from what others consider success when you know it is not your path. You can stay present in situations others flee because you are not running from yourself anymore. And if you are not running from yourself, there is very little else you need to run from. But perhaps the most important gift is permission. When others see you living authentically, struggling with your darkness, and surviving, making choices based on your truth rather than their expectations, refusing to wear masks that no longer fit, something in them stirs. They may resist it. They may judge you. They may try to pull you back into the familiar patterns. But beneath their resistance, a voice whispers, "Maybe I could do that too. Maybe I could stop performing. Maybe I could face my darkness. Maybe I could become real." You become what Jung called a symbolic person, someone whose life points beyond itself to larger possibilities, not through perfection or achievement, but through authenticity, through the willingness to be fully human, fully yourself, with all the contradictions and complexities that entails. Your life becomes a statement that individuation is possible, that you can face your darkness and not be destroyed, that you can become whole and still belong to the human community. The gift you become is not one you give deliberately. It is what naturally radiates from a person who has done the work of becoming conscious, of integrating the shadow, of living from the self rather than the persona. You do not need to teach or preach or convince. Your existence is the teaching, the way you navigate difficulty, the way you hold paradox, the way you remain connected while being fully yourself. All of this instructs without words. In the end, Jung's vision of individuation is not about transcending the human condition, but about fully inhabiting it. Not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. Not about rising above your darkness, but about bringing it into the light where it can be transformed. Not about separating from others, but about connecting from a place of authentic selfhood rather than unconscious need. The journey changes you in ways you cannot predict when you begin. The person who emerges from the alchemical fire is both you and not you, simultaneously, who you have always been, and someone you are only now becoming. This paradox cannot be resolved through thinking. It can only be lived. And in the living of it, in the daily practice of choosing consciousness over automaticity, truth over comfort, wholeness over perfection, you become the gift the world needs. One conscious person in a sea of unconsciousness, one light in the collective darkness, one human being who dared to become fully human.